Doctor Who, the long-running franchise, is one of the biggest in not just Britain, where it first started, but also just in the world in general. It has references in everything you could possibly ever imagine, even stuff you wouldn't imagine would make references to Doctor Who. Doctor Who, of course, being about the Doctor, originally played by William Hartnell, all the way back in its premiere in 1963, going for 26 seasons before its cancellation leading into the Wilderness Years, and now in its 14th season since 2005. After 60 odd years of storylines, there's a lot to go over. And I decided, as a big fan of Doctor Who, it was time for me to start going over all of it. Welcome to every Doctor Who ever. I'll be talking about the classic Doctor Who storylines, season by season, all the way to the more recent stuff, and all the crazy stuff in between. There's a lot to talk about in terms of Doctor Who stuff, and maybe I won't be able to talk about all of it, especially in terms of the books. I'll try for most of the audio, I can tell you that. But as a big Doctor Who fan who purposely went out and bought a shirt with all of the Doctors now, after the one I had before literally was missing 3 of them, because that was 3 Doctors ago that I had that shirt, I thought, might as well be time. Now, I'm not necessarily a Doctor Who channel, but let me tell you, I will definitely have a big chunk of my channel going forward talking about Doctor Who. So let's start this monthly Doctor Who series with what exactly I'll be doing. Again, as stated, I'll be going season by season, with little things in between talking about the rankings of all of the Doctors themselves, storylines, some extra little bits here and there, and maybe even some stuff about the actors when they weren't Doctor Who, which is just stuff that people might be interested in, right? If you're new to Doctor Who, then definitely now is a good time to get into it. With the series being absolutely at a height at the moment, and probably the easiest to get into for, like, American viewers, more or less, at least the newer ongoing stuff. So mind you, I hope you come along with me with my big journey throughout all of Doctor Who. Who knows how long it will be, but hopefully it'll be entertaining nonetheless. As mentioned, for those who don't know anything about Doctor Who, it is of course about the Doctor, which of course at this point has been like 14 other dudes and 1 woman at a point, and it's been a, for the most part, incredibly good show for all 60 years of its existence, going all the way back to 1963 when it was one old dude. And now we come all the way to, of course, Ncuti Gatwa, who is the current Doctor. And of course, the series has had its ups and downs, its high points and its low points, and times where it just didn't exist, where it just ceased to be, for reasons we'll eventually get to. The Doctor, in their many different forms, of course, goes on the TARDIS, which of course is the 1960s police box, which is something they actually used to make phone calls, but now is so synonymous with the series that BBC owns the rights to this image, instead of the literal people that developed the thing, which is kind of funny, honestly. Battling many different kinds of iconic and weird aliens, ones that have thankfully been brought back many a times, others unfortunately have not, and others thankfully have not. Let's go over a little bit of what I plan to do with each of these Doctors. Starting all the way back in 1963, we of course got the William Hartnell era, which had 3 whole seasons, eventually ending in the 10th planet, where at the end of it, he of course was replaced in the beginning of the 4th season by Patrick Troughton. This, unfortunately, is during a time where the series is very different than what it would be even for the rest of its classic Who era. Not only are all of these storylines in black and white, but most of them, especially season 3 onward, just barely exist. Unfortunately, Doctor Who was very much a victim of how BBC went about dealing with its tapes, and which is just the way that TV did it in general back in the 60s. We don't need this, get rid of it. We need to reuse this film reel. It's a real hard commodity to come by. Just reuse them, who cares? This stupid idea is the reason why a lot of the footage of the original storylines from 1963 all the way to the end of Patrick Troughton's era in 1969 just doesn't exist, right? The original footage for most of it just doesn't exist anymore. Thankfully, throughout the many years of attempts at preservation and looking into who might have it somewhere in their attic, lots of the footage has returned, right? Some of it is in not grainy quality, and some of its audio is gone, but thankfully was recorded by some cool people, and why a whole bunch of it, though gone in its original form, is thankfully still around, thanks to that audio recording, findings and just snippets found in magazines. The worst case of this is Marco Polo, which if you watch it now, you'll unfortunately not be able to really fully enjoy it, because it's just like static images. It's a friggin' PowerPoint. Some of these have missing episodes, but not whole parts of the story, while there's whole parts of the story are just undone. Thankfully, if we haven't been able to record the footage, people have attempted to reanimate these things in differing qualities. Some are okay, some are pretty good. I'd prefer just we find the live action stuff though. Both of these actors are very great regardless of the fact that you can't watch most of their stuff in their original form, especially season 4. With William Hartnell giving this more crotchety old man who kind of learns to have fun and really begin to be a more caring person as he begins to see the people that he thought were much lesser than him because they didn't come from the planet he came from or the time he came from, and really was able to see how Earth was as good as it was despite the problems that it had. Patrick Troughton is a real good showing of that as being a much more younger, whimsical doctor with his funny little flute. Boy is he funny, especially by the end of the era when it's him, Jamie, and Zoe. That is probably my favorite trio, to be honest. Of course, for those who don't already know, and I'd be surprised if you didn't, the reason why it's 2 separate actors playing the same guy, and then, 13 others since, is of course because, well, William Hartnell was getting old at the point, so they decided to just randomly bring the guy out, replacing with a new actor, which they really just didn't try to explain at all till maybe the end of the Second Doctor era, and even then, really barely. The Doctor is, of course, a Time Lord who eventually, as explained at the end of the Second Doctor's era, just can do that. They just do that, and they're not supposed to do stuff with time, but they can with the TARDIS. While originally called Renewal, this thing of course called Regeneration would be the reason why there would be new actors all of the time, and why the reason why Patrick Troughton would pick up from William Hartnell, and why by the end of when Patrick Troughton decided to leave the show, they of course were able to replace him with the fantastic Jon Pertwee, who ran for 4 seasons, 1970 to 1974, who after the Time Lords went, hey, you can't do that, they basically put him on Earth without the ability to even use his TARDIS. Inspired by spy and action stories, the Third Doctor became a very different kind of feeling show. Still with, a similar vibe to it. It was still sci-fi and weird stuff. One of them was about friggin' dinosaurs. But it was more of a grounded whole series, and the Doctor, instead of using his TARDIS, used a funny, probably sentient car called Bessie. Eventually, though, he'd be able to use his TARDIS in small degrees and eventually fully by the end of his time, going mostly up against his arch-enemy, the Master, who of course was played by Roger Delgado. The Master himself is of course also a Time Lord who will be replaced by multiple other different actors throughout his time. We'll certainly be going over all versions of him and how great they are, though I must say, Anthony Ainley is my personal favorite Master.
Get a move on, Slowcoach.
Being good friends with Jon Pertwee decided to leave the show after the unfortunate death of Roger Delgado, so he ultimately passed these stories off to Tom Baker. I love the Third Doctor in all of his era, even though not all of it is necessarily perfect, it is all definitely entertaining. It also technically was nearly destroyed, at least in terms of their color form. They thankfully were able to figure that out in the middle of doing his stuff, where thankfully a lot of the black and white film recordings were able to be recovered, and a lot of that stuff was like recolored, so that's the way you're watching it now. Thankfully then going forward, there certainly weren't any problems with production.
Shut up!
The Fourth Doctor onward would really return us back into, let's go to a random new setting all the time. Though there certainly wouldn't be a lot of historical settings and wouldn't be too much of Earth throughout the Fourth Doctor's time. There will be lots of weird aliens and lots of weird traveling stuff and lots of weird people to meet. Cool companions, especially my favorite one being K9, the best one, who should absolutely return. I don't care what reason you have, bring that guy back. With the only really problem of Tom Baker's time being Shada, being a story made during the Actors Guild strike, thus unable to be completed except for people's later attempts to vaguely complete the story, which happened like 4 times. Just end it. It's not even that good of a story. Why? Tom Baker would unfortunately leave his era due to the fact that he really didn't agree with the new producer John Nathan Turner and the direction he was moving the show. Tom Baker is of course the most iconic of the Doctors and is the one that even still lots of people know as the Doctor. Although that certainly is changing as the years go on, he is the most iconic of this era of Doctor Who, and where more or less the height of the series is. Is all of his stories the best of all time? Certainly not. Certainly not season 16, But obviously, we'll get to that when we get to that. Peter Davidson would go from 1981 to 1984 and would continue on even into the big anniversary special, one of my favorite stories, The Five Doctors. Peter Davidson's era in general is just a lot of fun, and so is he, really portraying this much younger, faster doctor who just really brings a lot of energy to the role, which was starting to kind of wane by the point of the end of Tom Baker's era. Though there definitely really does seem to be a big change in terms of the quality and the direction of the show going forward. Certainly going into it, by the end of his time, as literally in the last episode of the Fifth Doctor's last season, season 21, would be the Twin Dilemma, which alongside being one of the worst stories of all time, would introduce the Sixth Doctor. Played by Colin Baker, who is not related to Tom Baker, he would be introduced into a little bit more of a scheming, darker doctor who really wouldn't care too much about humans and would be a little bit too arrogant. He ultimately would begin to learn by the end of his season to be a little bit less. They wanted to begin a, arc with this character, which they just kind of quickly fast-tracked when they just decided to change their mind in the second season of The Sixth Doctor, which was a season-long storyline and basically could be considered one story. When brought all together, has less episodes than the big, 14-part Dalek story, but okay. Alongside schedule changes and just Colin Baker also beginning to disagree with where the direction of the series was beginning to go, ultimately Colin Baker was kicked off the show, very just unceremoniously. It sucks because Colin Baker is both a great actor and also the Doctor as a character was starting to get better. I don't like Colin Baker's era as a Doctor necessarily, but I feel like the hate towards his Doctor just is very overblown. He begins with one of the worst stories ever, and it never really gets better, but it's not like his story is unlikable. There's a lot of fun parts to him, and he is actually pretty good, unfortunately, when his stories begin to not be. In the first episode of season 24, he is quickly written off and replaced by the great Sylvester McCoy, who ran from 1987 to 1989. Throughout the last 3 seasons of the show, as the show clearly began to take a downturn in quality, both in terms of how the show looked in camera-wise and effects-wise, the stories actually slowly got better over time throughout its unofficial 25th anniversary Silver Nemesis, leading into its ending Survival, where the Master turns into a cat. The Doctor was unfortunately canned by the producer, who really just at that point hated the show and wanted to see it die. The, at that point, controller of BBC One really hated John Nathan Turner, and BBC's new head of series, Peter Cregan, just decided to cancel the series outright. Though the production team really kind of wasn't fully told, and it was never a full cancellation, mostly because BBC, despite canceling the thing, they kept on it and kept allowing other things to keep making books and comics and other media because it was still a grade A bombbuster money maker. This was in fact the reason why they actually greenlit the Children in Need charity special Dimensions in Time, which is technically the 30th anniversary special, where it crossed over with a show called EastEnders that I will never watch ever in my life, not even for these videos. That special is of course the biggest pile of shit in the world, but also was the only thing that the fans would get for basically a decade, as fans themselves in a few small fan-made companies would be able to make their own fan-made movies as semi-official BBC stuff due to the weird way that BBC handles things that it owns. There were other Dalek things, other sort of Cybermen things, an Uton movie. Just the characters from the show would be in other stuff, and a lot of that stuff pretty good. It's in fact during this time where, of course, Big Finish was able to start taking the books, which at that point had been made by Virgin Publishing throughout the 90s and would continue doing so till the eventual revival period, would be able to start making all of their audio stuff based upon their books and eventually just their own stuff, and they've been doing that stuff ever since. All of these movies and books and audio would continue building the franchise into just crazy ways and stuff I don't think is necessarily canon. The only canon thing that was made until 2005 would be Paul McGann's The Eighth Doctor Who movie, that being in 96. Though he would reprise his role not only in audio but also in small stuff for specials, mostly in 2003 and 2013. The Eighth Doctor was supposed to basically use this movie, only titled Doctor Who with the coolest theme ever, into a full series. It probably would have been like a Doctor Who British type X-Files type show, which considering it was going on at the same time, we could have easily maybe seen a damn crossover between the two. Could you imagine that? But unfortunately, the TV movie didn't do well in America. It did great in Britain, and if they just went, oh yeah, the place that we come from. Hey, that works. Then maybe we could have gotten a whole show about Paul McGann's Doctor, but unfortunately, we didn't, so we'll never see that set ever again. Bye-bye! There were certain other Ninth Doctor attempts. In '99, for the big anniversary of the series, there was Scream of the Shalka, which brought Richard E. Grant as sort of the Ninth Doctor, just known as the Shalka Doctor, who apparently in some ways is canon, in ways that I think just break my mind. Another one is The Curse of Fatal Death, which was a funny joke thing made for the series Comic Relief, where the Ninth Doctor was played by Rowan Atkinson. That's right, Mr. Bean. But then later, shot multiple times by doctors, eventually also being played by Richard E. Grant, so he's two doctors. It's weird that it went in that order, because that is literally exactly what would happen. 9th, 10th, 11th, 12th, and 13th, with both 13th doctors being blonde women. The truth is stranger than fiction, especially when it is Doctor Who. Eventually, the real Ninth Doctor will be played by Christopher Eccleston. Of course, this series was brought back by constant asking by multiple producers, with the head of the series, the showrunner, of course, being Russell T. Davies. Unfortunately, Christopher Eccleston would not fully agree with Davies, and he would only serve for one season, being replaced by the wonderful David Tennant, who would play the Doctor for like 5 years, but only really 3 seasons, and multiple specials throughout 2008 to 2010. But God knows, they probably could have gotten him into like a whole series. Kinda just wish there was more with David Tennant. As someone who really loved this series and came into the Doctor Who franchise at around this point, though that certainly is nothing against Christopher Eccleston. Davies would leave, and inevitably the showrunner would pass into Stephen Moffat, as he would bring in the 11th Doctor, played by Matt Smith. The great Matt Smith had brought a whole other energy to him, as he would continue with a whole new group the next 3 seasons and the specials in 2013, leading into the big 50th anniversary special, which really brought everything together and even introduced John Hurt as the actual 9th Doctor. So it went 8th War, played by John Hurt, and then 9, in which we actually were able to get the transformation, which we never got the regeneration from 8th to 9th for years, and we just sort of had to imagine it, and now finally we got that. And then also another surprise of the fact that Tom Baker also showed up in that one. Weirdly enough, not as the 4th Doctor, but by some other guy who maybe we'll see in the future. I doubt it. The 11th Doctor would actually have to be the, last Doctor as accordance to the, rules of the series, as Time Lords can only have 12 lives. He's actually the 13th life, so oops. But thankfully, at the end of his time, he was able to get more regeneration energy and was able to turn into the 12th Doctor, played by Peter Capaldi. Stephen Moffat gave a whole other idea of how Peter Capaldi was going to work, being a little bit more grumpier and a little bit more darker. And very similarly, people kind of fell off, like how they did with the 6th Doctor, which is unfortunate because Peter Capaldi is a great actor, and in his last season, he started to get a lot better, as did his stories. But okay, eventually Moffat left, leaving into Chris Chibnall's unfortunate 13th Doctor era, with Jodie Whittaker now being the 13th Doctor from 2017 to 2022, which actually makes her the longest serving new era Doctor. By the way, isn't that strange, right? She liked being the Doctor, and if nothing else, I can say that Jodie Whittaker is a great actress, even though her time isn't fantastic for reasons that are not her fault. But inevitably, the series would thankfully not be cancelled, despite the actually dwindling viewership, as Davies would come back, bringing Tennant back with him, strange enough, as the 14th Doctor, as it would just go to a new face, who would be there for the 60th anniversary 3-part special before, splitting in half. And technically the 14th Doctor is still around, with the 15th Doctor still the same man, mind you. He's now, of course, played by Ncuti Gatwa, who's been playing him since 2023. God knows when we eventually get to the 15th Doctor, it will be time for the next Doctor, and who knows who he'll be played by then. I just know by that point, I'll have to change my shirt. But until that point, that is how we'll be getting through the Doctors. The classic series has a very different idea in terms of how exactly these series go, but still, we'll be going from season to season and fun little bits in between. So again, if you're new to Doctor Who, make sure you just stay along, and even if you're a fan of Doctor Who, come on this journey with me, and let's see all the stuff that you may have not known about, that some of which I still haven't fully experienced. It'll be cool to rewatch all the classic Doctor Who storylines and the newer ones, and just go through Doctor Who's history and hopefully enjoy most of it with all you guys. So, If you're new to this channel, go ahead and subscribe. Of course, if you have any other ideas of what I should do with Doctor Who and other non-Doctor Who stuff, then leave that stuff in the comments. But more importantly, stay good, stay safe, and don't be an asshole.